I'm very pleased to introduce John Rees, and the topic is Marxism history and how change happens. John Rees is a historian, broadcaster and activist. He's co-author of A People's History of London and author of The Leveller Revolution and The Algebra of Revolution, among other titles. He's a visiting research fellow at Goldsmiths and a co-founder and national officer of Stop the War Coalition. I'll hand over to you, John.
Anna, thanks very much. Well, there aren't really much bigger questions than this one. What is history and how does history change? How can it be changed? And it was an issue which Marx and Engels confronted right at the beginning of their political career, right at the beginning of their theoretical writings. They came to terms with this question, and I'll try and outline some of the things that they had to say about it. But first, I just want to underline the fact that everybody has a theory of history. Even people who don't think they've got a theory of history do have a theory of history. And it filters down into the kind of common sense. I'm not talking just simply about people who are academically studying this or who are politically involved, but pretty much everybody has some kind of view about the way that things happen, even if it's the kind of view that says, well, whatever happens will happen. That's a theory of history, that what's happening around you is inevitable. Or the old adage that there'll always be the rich man in his castle and the poor man at his gate. That's a view of history. It says that basically, whatever the outward forms of change might be, fundamentally, there's always going to be classes, there's always going to be inequality, and nothing fundamentally will change over time. That's a theory of history. There are theories of history which say that it's basically accident. Who knew that the Archduke Ferdinand would be assassinated by a Serbian nationalist and that would trigger the whole of the First World War? That's a kind of accidental theory of history. In fact, there's a very entrenched view about the English Revolution of the 1640s, which says that it was just down to sort of bad government and mistakes by Charles I, and we need look no further, no deeper to find out why the English Revolution, a seminal moment in British history, why that happened. Or there are certainly very many modern theories of history which say, well, really, theories of history are just an imposition of somebody's belief onto the known facts. It's a kind of, this is the view of some postmodernists, of people influenced by Foucault, that theories of history are simply exercises of power, which one group of people seeks to impose their view of the world on others, and that who could possibly know whether it's true or false, and certainly no appeal to the facts will do it. At the other end of the spectrum, there are people who believe that the facts speak for themselves, that all we have to do is uncover the events and they will tell us how and why they happened. The historian A.L. Rouse once said, in history, chronology is everything. In other words, once we've got the idea that this happened after that, and after that something else happened, that will reveal the meaning of history. So there are around us all the time, announced and unannounced, different theories of how history happens, whether or not it's possible to change it, what history is and what it can tell us. So nobody's free of this, and certainly political activists aren't. They meet these kind of ideas all the time, expressed either in theory or as common sense views. Marx and Engels, of course, were no different to us. They confronted the theories of history that were around in their day, and they chose to confront, or they chose to engage with, probably one of the most powerful theories of history that has ever been developed in the course of human philosophy. And this was the theory of history developed by the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Hegel. He lived from 1770 to 1831. Those dates are important because it meant that he lived through the entirety of the French Revolution and of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, a momentous, world-altering series of historic events. And Marx and Engels' fundamental view of history, the way in which they thought about history, was due to their critical engagement with Hegel's ideas. So let me just say a word or two about Hegel. He was profoundly influenced by the French Revolution, by the coming of the Enlightenment, that revolution in European thought, which sought to dispel religious frameworks of interpretation in the favor of rationalist, scientific views of the world. And it influenced him to such a degree that his philosophy revolved around the idea that it was revolutions in human thought, great transformations of the kind of common consciousness, which drove history forward. He even gave the name of Geist. Perhaps we might more sensibly interpret that as Zeitgeist, as a kind of dominant feeling of the age. And he believed that when that zeitgeist of the day inhabited political institutions, that drove them forward to great conquests like the French Revolution or like Napoleon's armies marching through Europe, they were representatives of a feeling of the age, and very little could be done to defeat or prevent them changing the world around them. And he thought, conversely, that when, for instance, particular views, perhaps certain versions of the Christian religion, for instance, once the age had passed them by, the institutions which they inhabited became, as he said, like dried out husks that are blown aside by the wind of history. Now, the great virtue of this, of course, is that it sees huge transformations in consciousness, huge changes in historical time, as something which is malleable, which is something which is changeable, which isn't constant and fixed for all time. So it couldn't be, easily reduced to a kind of religious view, which is essentially that whatever the apparent changes in the world around us, the fundamental things of the relationship between human beings and God remain exactly as they were at the day that humanity first appeared. So it was a theory of change. It was a dynamic theory of change, which saw that ideas played a dominant role. Now, Marx and Engels had a lot of time for this view. They liked the dynamism of the theory. They liked the sort of grand scale of the theory. They understood that certainly ideas were important and that they were, to a degree, responsible for change. But they couldn't go along with the idea that it was just this development of human consciousness, this the zeitgeist changing from one epoch to the next, which was responsible for the way in which change happened. And so they engaged not only with Hegel, but with one of his great critics in the young Hegelian movement, a group of radicals in Germany. One of the great critics of Hegel was a man called Ludwig Feuerbach. And Feuerbach was the modern inventor, or reinventor perhaps, of the idea that it's the material circumstances in which people find themselves, the material structure of the world, which is responsible for change. And Engels once put it like this. He said, we learned from Hegel, but we all had to pass through the fiery stream in order to arrive at our view. Now, that was the kind of literary pun that Marx and Engels were very, very fond of, because Feuer in German means fire and Bach means stream. So what Engels was saying is we had to pass through the kind of the criticism of Hegel by Ludwig Feuerbach in order to arrive at our own view of the situation. Now, Feuerbach's kind of materialism was a crude materialism, or vulgar materialism, as it's all called. He was an advocate, for instance, of the view that you are what you eat. Now, for some of us, that's a vaguely terrifying prospect. But whatever, or indeed however kind of reformed and perfect your diet might be, you can see that it's a little bit of a stretch to reduce the entirety of human history and human experience to what you eat at dinner time and lunch. So they rejected that view, but they understood the force of it as a criticism of Hegel. And what it drove them to was a kind of amalgam or fusion of Hegel's view of history and Feuerbach's materialism. So in a very famous phrase, Marx and Engels said, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being." That was Hegel's view. He said, it's not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but their being that determines their consciousness. In other words, it's how people live their lives, how indeed they survive in a hostile world, how they get from the natural world those things, food, clothes, shelter, that they need in order to simply live. That's the thing which shapes their consciousness. And that this was a historical process. And this is what they continued to take from Hegel. It was something that changed over time. You know, primitive Paleolithic man didn't work and get what they needed from the natural world in the same way as the industrialized societies which Marx and Engels were part of in the 19th century. And as society changed its way of getting what it needs from the natural world, the tools available to it, the way in which the productive process worked, the way in which people labored, as those things changed, so people's intellectual capacities, their imagination, their religion, their cultural life, their political imagination, all this changed as well, in a famous phrase, which is often criticized as being reductive, but needn't necessarily be. Marx and Engels said that the hand mill gives you society with a feudal lord, whereas the steam engine gives you society with a capitalist owner. In other words, the way in which the social structure changed was dependent on the way in which people got together and worked in order to get what they need from the natural world. And I'm only going to use one longer quote in this session, but it's an important one. It's from the German Ideology, which was the book, a huge book that Marx and Engels wrote in criticism of Hegel and the young Hegelians. And in that they wrote this: "History is nothing but the succession of separate generations, each of which exploits the materials, the capital funds, the productive forces handed down to it by all the preceding generations, and thus, on the one hand, continues the traditional activity in completely changed circumstances, and on the other, modifies the old circumstances with completely changed activity." Now, as often with Marx and Engels, there's a hell of a lot compressed into what is actually, now I look at it, simply one sentence. What they're saying is that human beings, of course, we're born into the world. It doesn't arrive created as we're created. We arrive born into a pre-created world. It has a certain way of producing wealth, a certain way of organizing labor, and we inherit that cultural, material, capital in this society, productive process. We enter, when we're old enough, into a labor process which is predetermined. We don't choose to be in wage labor any more than a medieval serf chose to be in a feudal landowning society. We're born into that. We inherit the previously accumulated methods of production, methods of laboring, the capital fund, as Marx puts it in that quote. But, of course, and the longer you live, the more you see this, across your lifetime, that productive engine gets changed. You know, in my lifetime, we've gone from a mechanical age into a computer age, just in my lifetime. Enormous transformation of the way in which production is organized. And so we inherit a previously organized set of productive relationships, but in the course of engaging with them, we change and transform them and change and transform ourselves. And that's the essential model of Marx's view of history. If you had to choose a single sentence which sums it up, that would be the sentence that you would choose. Now, just to sort of move on a little bit, that, as I've mentioned before, is often criticized as a reductive view. In other words, it says, the criticism is this: look, how can you say that all people's artistic experience, all their artistic productions, what they think, how they act, how can you say that this can all be reduced to, that's what reductionism means, reduced to the economic structure of society? Now, of course, Marx and Engels weren't making that point. If they'd been making that point, they would have been part of those groups of people who believe that history is essentially predetermined and unchangeable. But as you see, even from the quote I've read out, they didn't mean that. They meant that you inherited a certain set of circumstances, and then in the course of interacting with them, you could change them. Men make their own history, as Marx and Engels wrote, but not in conditions of their own choosing. In other words, there are a set of possibilities which you inherit, and on the basis of that, you can change society in certain ways. To kind of illustrate that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Marx's conception of class, because that also is often accused of being a reductionist or simplistic. And the way I want to explain this is to say that there are 5 important ways in which Marx talked about class. All of them are related, but none are the same as each other. So the 5 types that I'm going to talk about are class location, class interest, class consciousness, class organization, and class political representation. Now, as I say, they're all related, but they aren't the same. Class location is about what you do to earn your living. If you have to sell your wage labor and have no other means of surviving from day to day, week to week, month to month, then you're part of the working class. That's your class location. No matter what you think, if you have to go to an employer and say, give me a job, I need the money to pay the rent, you are part of the working class. That's where you're located in the society. Class interest is different. We know plenty of people who don't act according to the interest of where they're located. I mean, no working person, if they were acting in their own interests, would vote Tory, because demonstrably the Tory party continually and for hundreds of years has attacked working people. So they're acting differently to their interest. This, of course, is linked to their consciousness. Some people are class conscious, understand where the interests of their class lie and act accordingly. Some people are not class conscious, have what Marxists sometimes call false consciousness, believe that Tories or landlords will act paternally towards them and it's in their best interest to go along with the system and not to challenge it, and so forth and so on. But even if you understand your class interest and develop a class consciousness which is consonant with it, doesn't mean to say that you're organized. Doesn't mean to say you're necessarily in a trade union or in a political party that represents working people. Those questions are questions of class organization and class political representation. What's really necessary for fundamental change to happen is that all those 5 forms of class align. That a class, a group of people who are located in the same position as workers, are conscious of their interests, are organized, and are politically represented. And that's what the struggle really to change society is about. It's about trying to get people who are located in the same position as workers to understand their interests, to become conscious of them, to organize on that basis, and to become politically represented. That's what political parties and trade unions do in this society. They express a particular social location and the possibilities of changing society based on that. political parties are crucial in this, because political parties are ways in which the social position of workers, their class interests and their class consciousness are formed in struggle with other classes. So you'll never get a fundamental shift in the society until you get working people organized, conscious, and politically represented. That's what, in its small way, Counterfire seeks to do. It's what other organizations in the working class attempt to do partially or wholly. And that, in many ways, is exactly the point that Marx and Engels were making when they came to write their theses, the famous theses on Feuerbach, which were, by the time they'd engaged with Hegel and engaged with Ludwig Feuerbach's criticism of Hegel, they came out with what must be one of the shortest but most meaningful documents in the Marxist canon, where they said the this-sidedness of our thinking, in other words, whether or not what we think is a true and accurate representation of the historical possibilities around us, the this-sidedness of our thinking is proved in practice. That it's only by engaging with the world and attempting to change it that we can know whether our theory of history is accurate, inaccurate, partially accurate, needs amending, and so forth. That's why the famous phrase that ends the thesis on Feuerbach, that philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point, however, is to change it. That's a far weightier phrase than some people sometimes think. It sounds, if you don't know the background, as if it's simply a call to action, that philosophers are just carrying on and thinking stuff, and we need to sort of get on with doing stuff. But it's not that. It's not a rejection of interpreting the world. It's saying that proper interpretation of the world requires political practice. We can only know what there is by engaging with what there is, and we can only change what there is by knowing what there is and acting on the basis of it. It's a true unity of theory and practice. That's what particularly a revolutionary organization provides in a collective way, because we talk now, I'm talking now, as if this is an individual process. It's not. It's a collective process. You can only how much can you personally know? You know, how much can you personally see about the rail strike? I mean, I can see my picket line. I can see one demonstration. I can't see all the demonstrations, even that took place yesterday on this one question. To collectivize the experience and to act collectively requires party political organization. And that's
John.
The whole philosophical tradition that I've talked about links up with the business of practical revolutionary politics in everyday circumstances. Okay, thanks very much, Hannah.